most valuable currencies I know of is information. Now you probably recognise that quote, it's not mine. It's a lovely, lovely quote. It's cuts right to the heart of it. And if you don't recognise it, it's from the 1987 film Wall Street, my favourite Michael Douglas. And I think that in some ways sums up quite well what I do and and how it can have an impact on this industry. So as I say, in some ways I feel a bit of an outsider because I've never had to trade anything. On the other hand, I'm a bit of an insider because I speak to all these people all the time, every day. People, you'll go into my stories and you'll see quotes from Scott O'Malley, from Steve Grobe, I know Matt. I know quite a few people. And so any given day, any given week, I will end up speaking to traders, to chief executives, to risk managers, to lobbyists, to who else we've got, policymakers, sometimes politicians. And so I'm forever gathering information. And I think what some people often have this construct in their mind of what the market actually is. And they say, on the one hand, we've got the buy side. We've got asset managers, pension funds, hedge funds, people who manage money. And on the other side, we've got the sell side, the investment banks, the brokers, market makers are the sorted middlemen. And I think that it's not a false picture, but it's incomplete. So I think that actually there's a very third important constituency that makes up a market, and that is, of course, information, because it shapes our opinions, it changes our opinions. People suck it up every day. It drives the market. A market without information doesn't trade, doesn't move anywhere. It's illiquid, and then nothing happens, and everybody goes away. And illiquidity is just the last thing anybody wants in a market. And so information ends up being the most critical thing of all. And when you think about it, and what is a market, people get very lost very, very quickly in the terms. There's a lot of acronyms in there, and people often start talking in about concepts that seem very, very difficult. And to be fair, some of that is intended to obfuscate, because it increases the value of what somebody else does. But I think while the terms change, the ideas themselves remain. I mean, I'm sure most of you done English, and you remember your Merchant of Venice, and at the start Antonio introduces the concept of risk. His fortune is entirely dependent on his ships, which is dependent on the weather. Sometimes when I'm wandering around industry events, I sometimes think, well, he'd probably be very at home here once he got his head around the terms. So, and in the last 4 years, I think, what have I learned about this industry and the people in it? Well, for a start, most of the people are actually really nice people. As Kathy said, you saw from Kathy, they do actually have a decent work ethic. They've got their hearts and minds in the right places. They're not out to, these people aren't really anything to do with the popular image of bankers. They're just decent people who've got decent ideas about what they want to try and achieve, and how best to run a fair market. Different ideas, but different ideas make a market. And it is a genuinely interesting subject. I think it's intellectually challenging. Now, sometimes it does feel as if it commands about that much impact on the wider world. But honestly, its depth is tremendous. I mean, I often compare it sometimes with my colleagues who do, say, the retail industry. And they end up covering huge amounts of companies, and from here, doing supermarkets to all the way over here doing toys or something like that. And it's a very wide one, but there isn't anywhere near the amount of depth. And to be honest, everyone can be a consumer. Everyone can have an opinion, because everyone thinks, well, I know why this company isn't doing well, because I can see the product isn't very good, or it's not on the shelves, or something like this. This industry is very different. You actually have to have a knowledge, and I think that's a power that you can use here. Not many people can always understand the ecosystem of the market, and that, I think, becomes a very, very useful tool to have. I certainly found that at the Financial Times, where, I mean, I have some colleagues who know an awful lot about things, but they usually find out that there's something about the market that they know is important, but they don't know quite what, and so it usually ends up coming onto my desk, even if I don't want it to. But there you go. So it's a world that does encourage specialism. You find people who are specialists, maybe lawyers who can look at derivatives trading, or lobbyists who only want to talk about high-frequency trading. That's fine. And I'll speak to all of them because I want to find fresh insights. Maybe just think of something, look at something in a slightly different way. Or sometimes people just come up with the right words and phrases that really just sum something up. You heard from Steve Grob earlier. He's really good at that, as you can well imagine. I know Kathy meant, I think it was Kathy said he could be a lawyer. No, he couldn't. I know Steve. I don't think a lawyer is his specialism. So, supposing you what you've heard all today really does interest you, and frankly, it should do if you're smart and you fancy something intellectually stimulating, and you want to get pretty well paid for doing a hard day's work. This should interest you. Your basic foodstuffs, your nourishment, will come from people like me. I supply information. So, how do you deal with dealing with someone like me? Well, for a start, it comes back to the old human way again. You end up talking to people, and there's nothing that beats human interaction. Looking somebody in the face, eye to eye, sharing a joke, communicating an idea. Ultimately, that's all what it comes back to. Because when you strip all this away, the charts and the ups and the downs, and it still comes down to either, well, you've probably heard about either the fear or greed. Yes, that's part of it. Sometimes it's just simply, you see something that somebody else doesn't do. Well, why shouldn't you have a go at that as well? So, my job as a journalist usually ends up being trying to knit it all together. Yes, I trade in information, but to some extent I'm also part of the entertainment industry. I try and write something that people find interesting and want to read. Sometimes it can be really important. It can be important to investors. It can be important to taxpayers, policymakers. Sometimes people just want to be entertained on the tube on the way to work. Nothing more than that. That's all there is to it. So you usually get used to talking to people. So I end up having to judge the value of something quite frequently, if it's actually useful or not, how long it's likely to stay useful. And to be clear, when I'm talking about information, I'm not talking about insider information. All right, that's banned. Okay, that's really not good. There are times when I do get stuff that I know could move markets, so I have to be very careful. There are rules, and it's not a free for all, and I don't trade and I don't pass it on. But I know that it's an important thing. But when dealing with journalists, I mean, it's one of the interesting things is that sometimes people get very scared about dealing with journalists, have no idea why. Sometimes it feels like I've actually grown an extra head or a forked tail or something. But it's that's not really. I don't know why, because it just is. But two things always worth bearing in mind is one is that a decent journalist will always want to protect their sources. It's not in my interest to go around telling the rest of the world who I speak to, because then the value of something dries up, because everybody goes there. I'm not about to send everybody to go where my special stash is. And the second reason is because that special stash, that other person then may get really annoyed with you and not speak to you again, and then you've wasted that one as well. So, my incentive to actually to keep quiet about where I get information is actually very high. Now, what you actually find is that certain topics about this industry usually end up being quite revealing about how people see the industry and where it might be going in the future. And I think there's one really interesting case that's happening in the United States at the moment. It involves a high-speed trading company called DRW, and the US regulator is actually trying to prosecute them for market manipulation. And the twist here is that DRW said that they'd actually discovered that they felt that the market was mispricing assets, and that they put other deals on to try and bring the price back into alignment. Now, if this may go to court, it may not do, but it's been very closely watched. Now, I don't want to comment too much on the case because it might well be ongoing. The interesting thing for you guys, though, would probably be, where do you see yourself in this? And if you were in this industry, which role do you think you would play in this? Because the company that runs it was run by a guy called Don Wilson, really smart guy, who graduate from University of Chicago. Now maybe you could be him. Maybe he could be one of his fellow math guys who felt that they'd worked out the mispricing. Maybe you could write the software. Maybe you think you could be his lawyer out to defend him, or maybe you think you could be the prosecutor, and the prosecutor's lawyer out to try and find evidence of malfeasance in the market. They're all questions for you to think about and bear in mind. So, if this does begin to interest you, then perhaps you start thinking, well, where can I learn more about this industry on a day-to-day basis? Well, obviously, there's nowhere else to go but FT Trading Room. But if you did want to go somewhere else, there are a number of other media organisations that cover it, and I think honestly, it's just beginning to join the conversation through. And you've got the way the modern media works through social media. You've got mail shots. Is a fantastic way of beginning to get into the rhythm of the way that the industry thinks about things, the things that it finds most important, the things that you might think are most interesting to you. Wall Street Journal covers this industry well. Bloomberg does it very well. Reuters does it well. The one way you can actually get on one thing John mentioned is the John Logan newsletter, the daily email shop. If you're in any way interested, get on that. Get on the FIA, the Futures Industry Association, also does a daily email shop. That's worth getting on. These people will aggregate some of the news for you, and it will begin to give you an idea of where people are thinking, what they're looking at. Get involved on Twitter. Sometimes it feels like half the industry is on Twitter every day anyway. You don't have to join in if you don't want. You can if you do. But if you just want to follow it, you begin to see what people are talking about, where the interest lies. I'm not going to say this is what you need to do. Kathy did that far better than I ever could. You know your interests and what your strengths are far better than I. But because this is so diverse, you can honestly say there's probably something in here for you, whatever your interests really are. And that way you can actually develop a specialism. And that in itself becomes a value and a skill. Because if there's only one thing I do know for sure, that an asset, a piece of news that everyone has access to quickly loses its value, and it becomes a commodity. And once what's valuable is actually having a skill or something that not many people have, that you can then begin to use and trade. And essentially what you're doing is trading your own name, your own brand, and your own skill, and making yourself extremely attractive. And of course, what's attractive is what people want. That's just human nature.